right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Allen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event. In addition to tonight's program, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Tonight's lecture, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati, features Dr. Iris de Rode discussing François-Jean de Chastellux, a major general in the French army, a member of the Society of Cincinnati, and a cousin of the Marquis de Lafayette, who played a central role in the Franco-American alliance during the Revolutionary War. Dr. de Rode is a Dutch historian who specializes in the French participation during the American Revolution. She earned her PhD in 2019 at Paris 8 University Vincennes Saint-Denis for her dissertation, François-Jean de Chastellux, a soldier philosopher in the Atlantic world at the time of the Enlightenment. While working on her dissertation, she earned 14 fellowships, which included grants from the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, George Washington's Mount Vernon, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, the French Embassy in the Netherlands, and the French government. Dr. de Rode has presented her research at more than 75 international conferences and has been teaching American transatlantic and international history at the French University Sciences Po in Paris, France since 2013. Her current work focuses on a documentary film and an audio guide app that retraces the steps of the French Army on the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Trail, a new book titled Military Enlightenment on the Ground that examines the collaboration of French and American military leaders that secured American independence and is expected to be published in 2024 by the University of Virginia Press. And that's all in addition to the development of a lecture and podcast series, and that's a partnership with the Embassy of France here in Washington, D.C. But more recently, Dr. de Rode was also the recipient of the 2023 Ellen McAllister Clark Massachusetts Library Fellowship from the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati to continue her research for her new book in our research library here at Anderson House, a place where she is certainly no stranger to. In fact, there has been an ongoing joke between us about whether I would refer to her as a squatter in our library tonight while introducing her, as there is rarely a time where I don't go down there and see her working on something. So yeah, I told you I was going to fit in there, so sorry about that. But before I turn things over to Iris, Dr. de Rode, excuse me, I would be remiss if I didn't cover the normal housekeeping items for our virtual attendees joining us on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. de Rode at any point during the program using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions following the talk. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming our friend, Dr. Iris de Rode.
So thank you very much, Andrew, for the fun introduction. And of course, me being a squatter here is very true. I'm being quite often in the basement here, which is, of course, the beautiful library that holds a lot of sources, books, and historical documents on my research on the French and the American Revolution. So I'm very happy to be able to go here very often and, of course, see the library staff and everyone working here at the Society of Cincinnati and the American Revolution Institute. Thank you also for giving me a fellowship very recently to continue my research here. So I'm going to present today about François-Jean de Chastellux, the man you can see on the slide, of whom you might never have heard because he's quite an unknown French participant in the American Revolution. Chastellux is known for one thing by some of you, for his travel diary. He wrote a travel diary between 1780 and 83 while he was serving in America as the Major General serving directly under Rochambeau. I'll tell you all about that diary, but so maybe you know him for that. But for the rest, he's quite forgotten, and I will make him come alive again, I hope, tonight. So first of all, we can see him here on the painting that you all know, of course, the Surrender of Cornwallis. And you can also see how to pronounce his name, because some people have told me it's very complicated to pronounce for an American person, because there is an S and an X and L's you don't know what to do with. But you say Chastellux. Try to write it phonetically, not sure if it works. But anyway, so now you know how to pronounce his name, and especially not to pronounce the S or the X, Chastellux. And so he is on this painting, which might be surprising for some of you as you have not heard of him, because he's quite prominent there, of course. He's standing at the French side of the army. And so you can see, of course, that he is officially, let's say, remembered for his role in Yorktown and in the American Revolution. So François-Jean de Chastellux, you can see here how he evolved over the years. There's one painting that's a little bit known here in America because it's, of course, a Charles Winston Peale one that's in Philadelphia, but the rest are all kept still in the family's property. So you can see some of the paintings that you might have never seen here. And so I wrote a book, of course, about him, as you can see here, long French title, which is based on my PhD dissertation that has been published last year. So you might wonder why I've been doing all that research, because François-Jean de Chastellux is, of course, an unknown figure, and why would I devote my life about 10 years to the study of this man? Well, it started in a garden, which you can see here, which is the garden of my parents' holiday home in France. I'm myself from the Netherlands, but so I grew up under this tree. And according to the legend of the village where we lived, called Brassy, people told me that the tree had been planted by Lafayette himself. Lafayette, of course, being the Marquis de Lafayette, that has been an important part, of course, of the American Revolution, was told to have planted this tree in the garden after his American revolutionary experience, because he had brought a few of these trees back to France to spread this to his French friends. When I started to do some research on this, because I was very curious if this story could have been true, I found that it was not him. He had never set foot in our garden. He had no reason to be here in any possible way, but his sort of uncle by marriage, actually had. Chastellux has been around in this region. And so in the local archives of Dijon being known here especially for mustard, but there's also an archive there in which I found some sources on this person, Chastellux, that was, oh, here, sorry, I see something else on my screen, so that was confusing. But anyway, here you can see that François-Jean, of course, planted that tree. So the reason is that he was in touch with the owner of our home. And so I could see in some of the letters that he had been indeed coming back from America. He has been in touch with the person living in our home. And so the tree probably actually is from America, from the period of the American Revolution. It's also, as you can see, quite tall. So it is 250 years old. We have an expert here who has confirmed this, Dean Norton. Yeah, the story led me to this finding of Chastellux. I still had no clue who Chastellux was. I just saw the reference of his name, and I saw some vague letters that I didn't really understand. But what I did know is that there was a little village close by that is called Chastellux. And so in France, as you might know, the French aristocracy, of course, was named after the places they were from. And so probably he might have come from there. Here you can see how actually Chastellux is related to Lafayette, because of course that makes him quite interesting, and probably why the story has been mixed up over the years, that people have thought he is, that it was actually Lafayette planted it. So you can see they have a grandfather in common with the wife of Lafayette. I will not explain the whole story because that's very long, but D'Aguesseau, his name is the one that connects both people. Lafayette and Chastellux were very close, as we will see later too. And so Chastellux, I'm just going to show you the map. And so what's interesting is that the village called Chastellux has a huge castle, the Chateau de Chastellux. So I thought, let's go to the Chateau. And when I came there, it appeared that the owner that lives there today, Philippe, gave a tour of this castle. He explained that his family has lived there for 1,000 years and that it started as a Roman encampment and has evolved over the time into what you can see today. And so after visiting the castle, I asked him, do you know more about Chastellux and especially my tree? What's going on here? So he told me, that's so interesting. We have the same tree in our garden. So you can sort of see it. It's in one of these, well, you can see it well, but it's in the green zone on the right of the first picture. And so he explained to me indeed that he was related to François-Jean de Chastellux, the person that has actually been in America. And he also told me about this travel diary that I just mentioned before, the travel diary that he wrote during the American Revolution. So he told me, just go and read it if you want to find out more about Chastellux. And when I read it, I got very intrigued. He's describing his tour through America during the Revolution, where he's explaining that he's, of course, going through the different 13 states. He's describing the differences between the constitutions of the different states. He's describing those he meets with. He's describing what he thinks of nature, all these different things. And I was really getting into this story because he's traveling through the world of the Revolution through his eyes. And it's, if you have ever read it, it's just quite an intriguing book for that reason. So Philippe, here we can see a photo of Philippe de Chastellux, who still lives in the castle. And so when he gave me the book, he also explained to me that Chastellux is quite a forgotten figure, especially because the archive was thought lost, that he had, well, his papers had been lost, and so no one really knew. But so when I started to dig more to find out if I could find something about Chastellux in Paris or in other archives, I actually didn't find much because there was not much, but there were a lot of references in sources from the founding fathers, such as Washington and Jefferson, who had written to him and he had replied to them. So you can see that there are correspondences, but they were hard to identify. And so I went back to Philippe to ask him, don't you know if you have anything in your archive? And then he said, well, we have an archive, but it's a tower full of archives, which you can see in the middle. It starts in 1328 and is up until today. So 700 years of piles of archives. So he got he was overwhelmed himself by the quantity of his material, but he did say, let's go and have a look. Let's see if I have anything on François-Jean. And actually he had a huge collection of François-Jean's papers. There were about 5,000 pages in about 13 different boxes that has been indexed and collected by one of his family members in the 19th century. But since then, they just closed it again and no one really looked at it. So the family knew that they had it very vaguely, but Philippe was just not aware of the treasure that he actually had in his tower. The most important ones that I opened almost at the beginning was, together with Philippe, we opened a map and we saw the name Washington. So we opened the little map, which is a paper map, and we find 8 letters of George Washington, original handwriting, never really seen the light of day. So we go on and look for more. So we saw Jefferson's letters, Franklin's letters, Adams' letters, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, and so on and so on. Many different letters, all from all these let's call them revolutionary heroes. Then there's also the French, Voltaire and Diderot and d'Alembert had written to him, because besides from being a military man, Chastellux was also a philosopher of the Enlightenment. And he befriended people such as Voltaire and wrote to them frequently. He also wrote to the ministers of Louis XVI. You can see names here. Vergennes might be one that you do know because he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs during the American Revolution. He, of course, wrote to Rochambeau, Lafayette, and La Luzerne. So these are the people he was with mainly in the American Revolution. So all these sources combined really show both sides of Chastellux, but especially his extensive network of correspondence. His European sort of other correspondence also includes Hume or Bentham. So, of course, the famous philosophers as well, but also Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. And it just continues. And so this network shows, of course, that Chastellux was a central figure in the world of the Enlightenment, but also in the military time of his military circles of his age. There were a lot of different maps as well, such as the one you can see on the left, which is a map of New York of 1781. And there's also on the right, you can see that one, which is Rochambeau's papers that he had done of a campaign just before leaving to America to prepare his army for the campaign. And so what's interesting for us here, of course, today is that that paper on the right is here in the library. The reason is that the family decided to sell a few of the most important and especially most valuable papers. And so some of them are now in Mount Vernon, some others are here. And of course, that's very important because they can now be researched by historians. We're also working on making them available in a digital form so that actually everything can be researched by more people than just me. But now they're still closed because I'm finishing my book first. So going back to Chastellux and who he was, and then I'm going to tell you more about his American campaign. Of course, it's hard to identify someone based on 5,000 pages, but unfortunately for me, he wrote a letter to Jeremy Bentham in which he describes himself. He describes himself as being a soldier in the Republic of Letters. So he's a part of the Republic of Letters, which is that enlightened world. And what he says about himself is his real fortune is that he has friends. And this quote really perfectly summarizes the man because, as I already mentioned, he was this soldier. He had been fighting in the 7 Years' War as he started as a lieutenant and rose up until a colonel of his own regiment, the Régiment de Chastellux. But of course, he lost the war badly. The French lost the 7 Years' War, as we all know, leading to one of the motivations to, of course, support the American rebels after. But so his role in the 7 Years' War was an interesting one because he started to think on how to reform the French army in order to prevent such big losses to happen again in the future. So in the Republic of Letters, he was writing. Since his 19th birthday or his age, he was writing about lots of different topics. One of the most sort of exciting one at the beginning of his life was that he was writing about the inoculation of the smallpox. That was his first publication, which he was known to have done himself on himself. He inoculated himself and then spent 6 weeks being sick and then wrote about that experience. And he was referenced in many different books of the time as being the first Frenchman, which should probably be understood as the first aristocrats because often they did research on other types of people before doing it themselves. But anyway, he was known for that reason. And the King, Louis XVI, has said that following his examples, he inoculated himself and his children. So he also published more books about lots of different themes, such as music, about poetry, about animal magnetism, which is one of the scientific magnetic sciences of the time. But he mainly wrote his book called De la Félicité Publique, which is a book in English called On Public Happiness, which is a book about happiness throughout the ages, in which he describes different types of governments and the way people are happy or unhappy under different types of governments. This is a book that made him quite famous in America because it was translated and was then spread throughout the young United States. And quite some people are referencing them in their books or in their letters mainly too, that have read it and are of course very interested in this concept of happiness and which type of government you need to achieve that happiness. And so Chastellux combined both of his sides, his soldier side, his philosopher side, to develop ideas himself about what you can call the military enlightenment. The military enlightenment is a phenomenon that's not much researched. It is coming to light nowadays. There's a few books on it, but overall it's not very recognized within the world of the Enlightenment. But people like Chastellux were applying their enlightened ideas on the art of war, is how they call that. So when waging war, they would think in an enlightened way. They would, for instance, think of how can we create more equality in an army? How can we create more advancement by paying people more, by giving them more hope for the future? How can we distribute better food to make them more healthy? All these types of considerations were put in practice at the time. Another really important factor is that Chastellux, alongside Rochambeau, who is also part of this group, we're thinking on how can we improve the army in order to just prevent to lose as bad as they had done in the 7 Years' War. And they start to gather as much information as they can, study war as a science. So that's the military enlightenment. This is important because I'm coming back to it later. As you remember from the Jeremy Bentham letter, Chastellux considered himself especially lucky to have a lot of friends. And I think that's exactly what makes him interesting. It makes him relevant because he had a network. So he could have, first of all, an impact with all his ideas because he had a large network to spread them. But he also had this network where he could connect other people to each other. So he had a real influence in his own time by connecting the right people, but also spreading the ideas that he had. And as we will see, he was a very sociable man that people just happened to really like. And so he was a popular figure in the circles he circulated in. And so we'll see that especially during this lecture. So here's the friends. Okay. So George Washington wrote to him, this is one of the letters that I found in the archive, George Washington himself, to put an emphasis on his friendships, wrote that a deep and lasting friendship, a friendship with neither time nor distance, can ever eradicate. This is, of course, a very friendly letter. It's the letter that he wrote to Chastellux when he left again for America after they had spent a lot of time together. But it does show you the type of friendship that he had with Jefferson as well. Jefferson wrote to Chastellux's wife after Chastellux died that I had for him a very sincere esteem, which had commenced with our acquaintance here and had grown under a very intimate intercourse with him in France. Then Benjamin Franklin also wrote to him, I congratulate you on the success of your last glorious campaign, the American Revolution, Yorktown specifically, of course. And he writes to him, a philosopher endowed with those strong sentiments of humanity that are manifested in your excellent writings must enjoy great satisfaction in having contributed so extensively by his sword, as well as by his pen, to de la félicité publique, public happiness. So he's of course referencing here to his sword, his battle actions, but also his writing about the public happiness and all he had done to achieve the independence of the United States through his ideas as well. So these letters show not only his very wide network, but also, of course, how they actually appreciated him. And what I want to tell today by talking about the American Revolution is that friendships are a very important overlooked element that has led to the possibility of winning Yorktown. One of the problems, of course, that the Allies had, the French-American allies, is that they had not that much in common. So friendships that developed over time were actually crucial in order to gain trust, but also in order to work together. So these friendships are not just sort of a fun little anecdote, it's actually a crucial element of the alliance. Hello. So the Yorktown Campaign. So as we of course know, Rochambeau arrived in 1780 together with about 6,000 men. And they brought, of course, a lot of weapons, but especially the French army came to support George Washington's army in order to fight against the British. Rochambeau is the general, and so Chastellux was just under him. He was considered second in command, and his title is Major General. It's always a little vague, by the way. It's second or third, depending on the time, because another person, Viaud-Menil, was also there. But Chastellux is here responsible mainly for the logistical aspects of the French campaign. So he's involved in organizing mainly the provisions and the encampment and making sure everyone has food. Very obviously, that's what he does specifically. And for that, he had to negotiate a lot with the local people there. And one of the most important things is what he spoke English, and most of the officers around him did not speak English. So he became very quickly the liaison officer between the French and Americans here in Newport, where they just arrived. But I want to focus mainly today on the preparatory phase of the campaign from Yorktown. We all, of course, know Yorktown is the moment that the French and Americans won. But the question is often what happened before that? It's not, or I mean, the question has actually not really been asked. Most of the time when you read about the French-American alliance, you read that they arrive and then they just do the Yorktown campaign. And in between, there's a year of almost nothing. They're just waiting for reinforcement, waiting to make decisions. But if you look at Chastellux's archives and papers, you can read that they were not at all inactive. They were extremely active, but only a small group was. So he was, of course, part of that. So I'll focus on that now. So based on his archive, you can find a lot of references on the revolution. And it, of course, starts with his travel to America, where he's describing his entire travel. But then when he arrives, instead of being welcomed by the Americans as he had hoped, the opposite is happening. In Newport, Rhode Island, the people were not in favor of the French alliance. They were actually very hostile to it, because before the war that happened before the 7 Years' War, the French had been the enemies of the Americans. Of course, the Americans were then fighting in the British army, so they had fought against the French. There are a lot of very negative prejudices had started in that period and had spilled over up until the time there. So they thought the French were coming back to colonize them. They were thinking that they were sent by the Pope to impose Catholicism on the Protestant population there. But they were also thinking more sort of the real prejudices that might still exist today about the French being arrogant, that they were curling their hair, that they put all that powder on themselves, and they were not the manly soldiers that the Americans would have expected. Well, so then there's, of course, also the fact that they had very different armies. Their armies, the French army was one of the oldest armies, of course, of the world, one of the most powerful too, with a huge tradition, a lot of experience. And then there was this very new, what is often referred to as the ragtag army. This is, of course, quite well known. This is not just Chastellux writing this, but everyone that arrives, all the French are shocked by what they find. Instead of finding this very strong ally, they actually find a small sort of group, especially in Newport, and they're very disappointed. And they start to write to Versailles, to their army's administration, to ask what happened, why are we here, what are we gonna do, and how can we make this whole campaign a success? And so Chastellux starts to write some similar text to his army administration. And so one of his most interesting one is called On the State of Our Army, that he writes in August 1780. So they just arrived in Newport, and as I said, he's shocked. So he starts to write things such as, we wanted to crush the English because we thought the occasion favorable. But all in all, we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects, which of course is very negative to him. We will have to feed, clothe, pay the Americans, and even fight for them. Then he also said we are misled by Congress and greedy merchants. So he says that there was a lot of actually sort of disinformation going on at the time about the strength of the Continental Army, about how unified Congress was, because the French, well, they feel misled by what they had heard and what the reality is. Chastellux also describes his own mediocre aid. It's not just the faults of the Americans, it's mainly as well that the king had sent not enough men. So he said the aid we sent in America is very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion on our strength to the new ally. So what do you do in a situation as bad as this? They are thinking and trying to find solutions, of course, while having to survive in Rhode Island, where everything is extremely expensive. So they have a very hard time actually finding food and other provisions. And the situation becomes even worse during the Hartford Conference, which is, of course, a well-known moment in September, when Washington and Rochambeau meet for the first time. They discuss what they can do, and they conclude that they have not enough men, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough ships, and they cannot have any immediate action to attack the British. They still think of two different plans. One could be New York, which of course we all know is what Washington wanted. He wanted to attack New York City because that was the sort of symbolic center for the British power and where he had lost himself in the most humiliating way. So he thought, if we take New York again, we might actually really win the war. Then another plan could be to go to the southern states, because of course the British were also based there, and that campaign was a good alternative. But according to Washington, it would not end the war. It would just be a campaign that could be beneficial, but not the campaign, let's say. So they spoke about these two options, but couldn't take a decision because, of course, they didn't know how many people they would have at the new campaigning season, which would happen after this. One of the main reasons is that the French had promised to send 2,000 more men, and they were not there yet, and they had no idea when they would ever arrive. And another problem was that Congress themselves and the different states were supposed to send more people too, but no one really knew necessarily when they would arrive. So what you can see in most history books is that the period after this is described as a long winter of waiting for new supplies and just waiting out that the winter sort of ends. Washington stayed obsessed by New York is portrayed in most narratives. And then in a way, Rochambeau might have manipulated him or at least forced him in a subtle way to go to Yorktown. But if you look at a lot of other sources around this, you can see that it was not just as simple. It was more complex than that. There's a long, rational, collaborative decision-making process at hand and based on common research, but also friendships. So let's have a look at that. So Chastellux came with a solution. It's of course one of the solutions. There are lots of other factors that also participated to the main choice of actually going to Yorktown. But one of the forgotten ones is that Chastellux proposed to do a research mission. This is of course what you call a reconnaissance mission, but it was one of his very enlightened ways of thinking about war. He was suggesting, let's just do research. Let's understand where we are. Let's understand who we fight with. Let's understand what we can actually do here. And also let's stop having all these prejudices against these people. Let's actually study them and try to figure out if they're that bad or if there's maybe something we can actually do with them. So he proposes here in one of his reports that it would be necessary that one or more officers of the army of Rochambeau, together with officers of the army of Washington, would enlighten the ambassador. The ambassador is Luzerne, who is based in Philadelphia, who, according to him, was the one that was most misled by Congress and by others, because he didn't have the right information to make decisions for the French army. And so he proposes these officers would travel in the country, see the army, and measure the disposition of the people. And so this is, of course, an example of his enlightened ways of thinking, where they are gathering information to really understand the science of war. So this is practical application of what he was already doing while he was in France to think about war. What do we have to do? We study it in a scientific way, and he included, for instance, cultural, social, religious factors to these reconnaissance mission, in addition to the geographical or topographical details that he could find. So without going too much on the Enlightenment side, let's go to the practical side. So they did 3 different trips doing these reconnaissance missions. It started in November, and that was what he called the long tour of the continent. Then he did a secret mission of a few days to the Chesapeake Bay. And then he did the grand reconnaissance of New York, which is well known actually. But if you consider it in this larger perspective, it becomes clear that the French are doing a lot of research. And so the first step is November 1780 until January 1701. And Chastellux, of course, is not alone. As he suggested, he said, let's do this research together. So he's gathering a group of French, but also American people to do this research. So he himself, of course, is part of it, but then also his aide-de-camp called Montesquieu. Montesquieu is the grandson of the famous philosopher, which he brought for that exact reason, because he knew that that would gonna be interesting for Americans, and a few others where he would work with every day. So you have to imagine this is a group of Frenchmen, and they go to all the different places, and at these places they meet with Americans that would tell them what they knew about different aspects of the American Revolution. So they went to Knox, who, by the way, is hanging right there, and Hamilton and Humphrey, Stillman, Lafayette was involved, Washington himself was involved, but then also Jefferson, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, Samuel Adams, and Thomas Paine, amongst others. So the French are traveling around and are gathering all the information they can to get this information, and especially as well to make sure that they can form social bonds instead of being sort of enemies almost. They wanted to become, of course, close allies. So they do this very consciously, and they go for a lot of dinners, which always sound a little fun when you read them. But actually, these dinners are very important because they are coming together, sharing fun times, and become close to each other. Because, of course, during these reconnaissance missions, you can especially see in Chastellux' travel diary that he mainly describes all his dinners, which sounds quite boring to us today, but they're important at the time, as they are today, of course. So he goes to a lot of former battlefield sites with this group. And when he's at one, he will meet with the officers that have been part of a battle. For instance, West Point, Stony Point, Princeton, Trenton, and so on, this whole list. But so he's meeting the participants of the different battles to really understand them. He says in his book or in his writings, he says that you have to go on the ground to really understand. You cannot just take things for granted. You cannot read about reports. You cannot just assume that things are like that. You have to go there. You have to study it. He is literally interviewing the participants, reading different reports, and then making his own conclusions based on that extensive research. Obviously, an enlightened way of thinking. And while going to all these battlefield sites, his ideas are already starting to change. At the beginning, they only could see Newport and Rhode Island. But if you go further, you can see that at certain moments, obviously, the Americans have won and that they're actually better organized than the French assumed first. One of the interesting things that they made a lot of maps, which Andrew, of course, appreciates, all these different maps of the battlefield sites. But Saratoga, for instance, is one of these maps that are kept in Chastellux' archive that just show the rigorous ways of the French to do their research. So he brought 3 cartographers with him to make all these maps. One of the main issues that the French encountered was that they didn't have enough maps. So they kind of didn't really understand the terrain. So they needed to make them. And they also wanted to study the battlefields to understand their enemy, of course, but especially what they could do with the Americans in their own battle. So they added a lot of different things. They started to do, of course, geography, as I just said, studying the Continental Army in depth. Chastellux has kept lists and lists and lists of everything you can imagine on the army. But he also added more surprising things, you could say, like agriculture. So there's a lot of big reports on all the different states and how their agriculture is organized, how their trade is organized, how the political systems are, the religion, languages, customs, literature, science, arts, almost everything you can imagine, to really understand America way more in depth than you could imagine. His travel diary is a reflection of that, but if you combine it with all these reports, you can really see this extensive research. And he wrote parts himself, but all these others did too. So there's lots of different handwritings, and it's you can see really research reports. So just to give you a few examples of this through what he wrote, it's a long quote, I'm sorry, but it's a fun one because he describes agriculture. He describes the development of America because when he arrived in Newport, he saw poverty, he saw problems of the previous battles and especially British occupation that destroyed the city. So he was afraid that the entire United States would be a destroyed place. But luckily, he could find very easily that agriculture was booming. What he hoped for, mainly based on his De la Félicité Publique book on happiness, is that he hopes for the development of agriculture and then trade in order to create happiness for most people possible. Because if you have trade, it means you also can spend some time on your own, getting more enlightened. That's his main philosophy. So for him to see this in practice and it happening very fast makes him go makes him become more hopeful than he was before on the American nation in general, but especially for the cause of the revolution, because he could see a lot of wealth coming in soon. So he describes this situation where any man who has been able to obtain a fund of 600 or 700 pounds and who feels strong and willing to work can go to the woods and buy a portion of land. And then he can have a cow, a few pigs, and some what he calls mediocre horses that cost him not more than 4 pounds. Then with this first capital, he begins by cutting down all the small trees and clears the grounds. Then you can start the production. And then a few years later, the settlers had enough to live on and even enough to send food to the market. And after 4 or 5 years, he finds himself a well-off farmer. This is one of the many examples of his agricultural hopes and especially the development of this new country, which of course to him is really the basis of creating happiness in this new nation. He describes that, for instance, when he's at a little farm in Providence, where he describes a little establishment where comfort and simplicity reign, which gave an idea of that sweet and serene state of happiness, which appears to have taken refuge in the New World. Again, one of the examples he gives, so many of these, but he really is excited to see this development and to find this type of situation. One of the things he includes a lot is nature. And so natural phenomenon, he's studying that a lot. And one of the more amusing ones, just to make it all a little lighter, is one that he describes when he shoots a jay. And so to his great astonishment, the bird fell. So he can now observe it. And he is, of course, quite the poetic man. So describes this as, it's a truly magnificent creature. It's entirely blue, but it unites the various shades of that color in such a way that it surpasses the invention of art. So this is beautiful, but there's a problem with the Americans, according to him. He's studying not just nature, he's especially studying languages and customs. And here he describes that the Americans have a very poor language. He says the Americans call they call it only the bluebird, and the Americans have not notably enriched their native language. The jay is a bluebird, the cardinal is a redbird, and every water bird is simply a duck. So then he said, I could cite many more examples. He's doing the same with trees, but then it says it's sufficient to observe that this poverty of language proves how much men's attention has been employed in objects of utility and the desire of augmenting wealth. A French observation of that. So it's just, I'm giving these examples to show you that he was including many factors to really understand America and starting to really understand the alliance better, which of course also led him to remark on lots of American customs and practices. And then the one of toasting he found particularly ridiculous, actually. He says at the beginning of each meal and the first time one drinks, each individual is successively called upon to drink to his health. So everyone's standing with their glass, and then it's enough to die of thirst for the actor of this ridiculous comedy, which he is obliged to look around the table for the names or looks of 20 or 30 people. Wow. So these are, of course, quite sort of funny little examples, but it's just to show you the level of preciseness and all the different things he's observing himself, but also the others he's with. And so from the battlefield sites to really the toasting, he just describes everything. And this is really a part of the military tradition of his time, and especially a new one because they include so much. So here we can see a real turning point when Chastellux finally meets George Washington himself. As I already said, he was quite disappointed by the American army, but going to the different sites and meeting a lot of the generals, he became more and more intrigued. But when he met Washington, his whole perspective completely turned. He describes here Monsieur Lafayette, of course, who he knows very well, was in conversation with a tall man. He introduced me to the general himself. And then he says a few glasses of claret and Madeira accelerated the acquaintances I had to make. And soon I felt myself at ease near the greatest and the best of men. So Washington to Chastellux became a very close friend, and vice versa, of course, because they had a lot of things in common that went way beyond their military campaign. They were interested in, of course, the development of agriculture. They were interested in theater, in music. They were interested in different scientific objects, and of course, especially winning their war. And so Chastellux starts to describe him so many times in the most positive light. For instance, here, where he describes him as the idea of a perfect whole. He has everything from a general in a republic to a hero of the republic. And he's born for the idea that salvation of each individual is attached to his person. He also describes many others that are, of course, for importance here during the Society of the Cincinnati, such as Henry Knox. He also gets very, of course, inspired by meeting these figures that are showing him the battlefield sites, that are showing him America. And then he says, it would not be enough to praise him only for his military talents. It would be to deprive him of half of the eulogium which he merits, a man of understanding, a well-informed man, gay, sincere, and honest. It's impossible to know him without esteeming him or to see him without loving him. He also, of course, describes Hamilton, with whom he spends a lot of time during these missions, and says, with his talents and knowledge, Mr. Hamilton must be in peace as well as in war, one of the most considerable citizens of his country. He's also a most elegant writer and a perfectly accomplished gentleman. So all these examples are one of these examples that show that Chastellux becomes more and more sure of the fact that actually with the Americans, they can win the war instead of losing it, quite obviously, when they were in Newport. He describes excellent leadership and especially says, perhaps this army, notwithstanding the slowness of its maneuvers and his inexperience in the war, may merit the praises of Europeans. And of course, he mainly discovers and writes about the fact that they're not that different as they thought before. They're interested in a lot of the same things. They have the same enlightened way of thinking about warfare. When they study it together, they discover that. They discover they have similar political ideals, and of course, all these ideas of agriculture, trade, but also science and arts. And especially this leads for both parties to newfound hope. They can do something together if they continue this research. And their friendships, of course, are very important in order to understand each other and not mistrust each other. So I'll go quicker over this second step because there's not much on it, but also because time is running, of course. But step 2 is that Chastellux goes on a secret little mission by boat to the Chesapeake Bay to observe the Chesapeake Bay. And he starts to write a report on this, which is quite crucial. And so he shares the result of what he sees at Chesapeake Bay, of course, is a good point that you can encircle with the fleet. And he sees that, and other people knew that too. But he writes that to La Luzerne. La Luzerne is that ambassador of whom he had written before, that should be the one that is more informed. And so Chastellux brings his research results together with the little group he is with. So there are about 10 Frenchmen. They go to Philadelphia where he lives, and they bring all their reports and material that they gathered. And so La Luzerne, of course, is very interested in it, but especially his ideas start to really evolve. He's writing to the French minister after this meeting that the South requires the most active assistance from us. I cannot too strongly insist on the necessity of putting ourselves without delay in a state of action. And without going on and on about the details of what they exactly write and how that goes, you can see that La Luzerne, the French ambassador, was the one that was really pushing for Yorktown. So this whole idea that it was actually Rochambeau that was manipulating Washington, or that it was maybe de Grasse, the admiral, who came with his main fleet, of course, to the Chesapeake Bay, that was his decision. That's maybe also partially true, but La Luzerne and Chastellux play a very important role in this in the background. And this is just not recognized today because the sources were quite lacking, because most of them are in the Chastellux archive. But it really adds 2 important figures to this whole decision-making process of going to Yorktown. And so you can see here that La Luzerne starts to send this report in which they have, so with Chastellux, he wrote, by the way, I have to say, La Luzerne was also a military man. He had been fighting in the 7 Years' War together with Chastellux, Rochambeau, and others. So they were part of the same group. And so they could write, he was an expert in the writing about war himself too. So with Chastellux, they wrote this report called Report on the Southern Campaign, which they're going to send to Washington himself, to Rochambeau, and also to de Grasse. And so it's not very totally clear what the exact impact is, but you can see that the tide changes, and that, of course, this idea is already existent and officially considered way before that fatal, or that moment in August when de Grasse says that he's going to come. And La Luzerne specifically is really pushing for this. I'm just going to go over this a little bit because it's the Wethersfield Conference. And then, of course, they decide that they still want, so the Wethersfield Conference is a moment where Washington, Chastellux, and Rochambeau meet. And Chastellux and Rochambeau are, of course, very much pushing to go south. But still, Washington considers that too dangerous. He thinks that the march to go there will be too dangerous, too hot, specifically with the climate, and that the New York expedition would still be preferable if they would had enough people to do so. So the French, of course, have to do what he says because he is their superior commander. And so they do go to New York. And this is a moment where they continue their long research. In New York, the French arrive, they junction with the American army, and with about 5,000 men, they're going to pretend to attack New York, which is called a reconnaissance in force mission. And in that mission, they are starting to see where the British are based. So they can observe, they can see the fortifications, they can calculate where they all are. And one of the main conclusions, of course, is, where is that? Oh, here it is. And so one of the main conclusions of all this is that this is the Chastellux report, but there's numerous others too, that it's way too dangerous to actually attack New York. So this research, again, plays an important part in understanding the war and especially deciding not to go to New York. Because, of course, as most people already knew, even George Washington, of course, he was not that foolish to think he could actually attack. He knew he needed more men, but it became confirmed by doing their research that took 3 days and, as I said, 5,000 men to do. And so he says, it must be admitted that they would require much superior means than those we can add and could dispose of. The enemy could make our best hopes vanish in an instant. So Chastellux and Washington and all these people that are part of this, of course, now realize we cannot go to New York. But one of the things is, of course, that Chastellux and these others have already kind of prepared this other campaign. Quite often it's called the miracle of Yorktown. They prepared it in just a few days. But of course, with this research mission, they had all the information they needed to go south quite quickly. And so George Washington, of course, himself finally has understood too. It's not that he was he was advised, of course, he was open-minded enough to say, okay, I'm going to follow this advice. He sees it in front of his own eyes. He has done himself that rational research together with the French. And so they do decide to go to New York. One of the reasons, of course, too, is that Chastellux and him are quite close, and Chastellux writes to his sister to make this decision, took many conferences with General Washington, whose interpreter I've always been. He was mainly translating with Rochambeau, but he was really part of this mission. And so that's the point. Of course, a lot of other factors such as winds or tornadoes were also part of this story. But still, I want to just emphasize that La Luzerne and Chastellux played quite an important role in making this campaign possible. And so August 14th is that confirmation that De Grasse actually is arriving. And based on what La Luzerne sent to him, this report and what Rochambeau sent to him and others, he decided to go to the Chesapeake Bay, which of course made the encirclement of Yorktown possible. And so finally, the Siege of Yorktown. And La Luzerne writes to Vergennes, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that De Grasse had told me upon his arrival on these shores that my urgings had determined him to lead all his forces into the Chesapeake Bay to the aid of Virginia. So La Luzerne is an unrecognized hero, we could say, in this whole campaign. And so, of course, they go to Yorktown quite quickly after. We all know that the whole march and the importance of gathering all the different units and the Navy all together at Yorktown, which works out. So that's quite an impressive march they do. And of course, they go quite close by because there, I don't know where it is located from here, but there's this Luzerne bridge, which is quite, you can see it on little, on the road. And so that's a place where one of the units was walking. And so they also encamped in Georgetown quite close by. So that's just a fun little anecdote because they came, you have to imagine, about 9,000 men were walking down to Yorktown. So that's the Yorktown campaign. And so to go to Chastellux at Yorktown, because you might wonder what he was doing, he was, of course, taking care of logistics again, as he was always doing, but he was also fighting himself. There's this description of him where the enemy threw himself into the battery. So this is during the attack of Redoubt number 9. And so Chastellux himself went there fast as thunder with the 2nd Battalion of Soissonnais, and his appearance made the enemy withdraw, killing or wounding about 20 men and taking 18 prisoners. So he's considered one of these heroic figures of the battle himself too, but of course was mainly important for his strategic planning of it all. And so when he returns after this battle, he receives many letters. We remember the one of Franklin, but he also receives one of Samuel Cooper, who says almost the same as Franklin, saying, many battles have been won on the side of liberty, but few warriors besides Chastellux have been able to teach us how to improve such advantages to the greatest happiness of mankind. You will leave in the grateful memory of America so much indebted to your counsel and your sword. Here, George Washington adds another layer to all this, saying, I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you. So again, the importance of these friendships are quite crucial here, and we can see that the one between Chastellux and Washington was quite deep here. Washington didn't have, it wasn't really his tone usually to write this type of letters. There's been one letter where he wrote the same, which was to Martha Washington herself. So now I'm gonna, of course, conclude, but I will talk a little bit more about the Chastellux' American friends when he returned to France. So when he came back in 1782, he stayed in contact with all these friends that he had made during his American campaign. These include, of course, people that we have all already seen so often, but of course, Washington is part of it, but also Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, Jefferson, and Henry Knox, Franklin, other people he was involved in. And he was continuing to write them mainly because of his friendship. So they were just sharing fun facts about themselves. But Chastellux also really had a mission to improve the French-American relations that were quite deteriorating at that time. He was hoping for French-American trade mainly. And he was trying to set that up, especially with Gouverneur Morris and Robert Morris. But he was also still in touch with his friends from the Society of the Cincinnati. So of course, Chastellux himself was part of this. And just to finish up and to again show this sort of continuation of the French-American friendships that had been so crucial for the campaign of Yorktown, they continued, of course, afterwards, even up until today. And this building, of course, symbolizes that quite obviously. So when Chastellux was back, he received a few letters. One of the first one he received was of Knox himself saying, "We have formed the Society of Cincinnati." He wrote Cincinnatus, by the way. But so to which we have taken the liberty to associate the generals and colonels of your army that have served in America. He describes that it's an act of love and that they want to remember their friendships, but also especially prevent other types of wars in the future by creating this bond between these French and American officers. So Chastellux then writes to Washington about this and says, all the military gentlemen with the rank either of general or colonel have been to America, and they all wear the Order of Cincinnati. And it says the nation sees the decorations with pleasure, as it recalls to their mind the most advantageous war, as well as the most valuable alliance ever made. Little note that here you can see his handwriting, and it's very hard to decipher. So that took me a lot of time. But yes, this is Chastellux's handwriting. Then he also describes, I am persuaded that this establishment will triumph over all the enemies that it meets in America. And I hope your country will understand how to unite the glory of the military to the liberty of the citizens. This is quite sort of a cryptical sentence, but it alludes to the enemies that the Society of Cincinnati had exactly for the reason of the American Revolution, because it was considered anti-Republican. It was considered anti-Republican to consider the sort of European knighthood and eventually create a sort of aristocracy within the Republic. And of course, we all know this story, especially here. But Chastellux was commenting on that specifically and hoped that they would overcome these issues to still be able to celebrate their friendships. Especially the hereditary character was quite criticized because, of course, it would create a specific group separate from the citizens of America at the time. And Chastellux quite agreed actually with that, because of course he wrote that he wants to unite the glory of the military with the liberty of the citizens. And a lot of people agreed with this, of course. And so you can see that in 1784, George Washington wrote again to Chastellux about what had been decided. And so after certain meetings, they had decided, of course, to reform the Cincinnati and to leave a few of the original principles. And of course, I don't have to tell you what they all, of course, were, but it's just interesting to see that Chastellux was involved in these writings about this. And so sorry, I'm still in my thing. But so Knox writes to Chastellux after this too, after this reform has happened, when the hereditary character had been abandoned, which by the way will be reinstalled later. So you might wonder what happened, but that's 19th and 20th century other reforms. But so during this specific period, they were adapting the society in order to fit more into this Republican values. And here you see Knox writing about that, and especially say, we were extremely solicitous to adopt your idea of attempting to reconcile the glory of the army with the liberty of the citizen, and we flatter ourselves that we have effected it. I don't really know if he really means that Chastellux greatly inspired him, but of course he's flattering him a little here to say, we did what you told us to do, but they of course knew what they had to do. But he especially added that they were harmless in their intention. They only had for its real object the perpetuation of friendships and recollection of past dangers as a stimulus for future exertions. Here we go. And so Chastellux continued his sort of endeavors to embellish, to create more French-American friendships, and to especially propagate a positive image of America in France. He published his travel diaries under encouragement of Thomas Jefferson. He didn't really want to publish it himself, but Jefferson considered it important so that people had a positive, beautiful view of this young United States that was expanding. And then he was also writing about America again in another book that he published, which was on it's the importance of the discovery of America, which he considered extremely important, especially for Europe, mainly for the trade that could start by having such a huge lands, of course. And so he writes, America is a sanctuary for reason, liberty, tolerance, and an asylum for peace and happiness. And then he continues, oh, motherland of Franklin, Washington, Hancock, Adams, who could wish that you did not exist for them and for us? So we can see this, his sort of main mission in life is really to propagate this image of America and this independence and all his different values that he believes in so ardently. Then he starts to work on a book on how to reform France based on the American example. He, of course, has seen the ideas of more freedoms, more liberties, especially no aristocracy. And he himself, as an aristocrat, is proposing to abolish the aristocracy, or at least the privileges that come with it. He wants to create a more equal society in France too. He doesn't want to make it a republic, but more a mixed constitution. And so this is a book that he never finishes. He actually died in the middle of writing it. So you can actually see all his notes and they just stop. But you can very well reconstruct the way he was thinking and what he wanted to write, at least during this time. So between then and his death, very quickly, he out of a sudden marries a woman called Brigitte de Plunkett. So he had never been married before. He had sort of a mistress for about 25 years, what's normal in France at the time, but he was with someone who was actually married herself for all that time. But at sort of the end of his life, he falls in love with someone who is 27 while he is in his late 50s. And they both fall in love, and you can see in the archive a huge collection of their love letters that are really quite beautiful, actually. But so Washington writes to him, and this shows the continuation of their real friendship. And he writes about a wife. Oh, my dear marquis, I can hardly refrain from smiling to find her caught at last. And he describes the terrible contagion that he had actually apparently got in America, according to him, which was domestic felicity, which, like the smallpox or the plague, a man can have only once in his life, because it commonly lasts him for his whole lifetime. And then he makes, of course, the joke, at least with us in America. I don't know how you manage these matters in France. And again, this is a very unusual tone for Washington, who is really not known to make jokes, but with his friend Chastellux, they obviously do. And at the end of Chastellux's life, very unexpectedly, he just dies of what his wife calls a very bad fever. He had lung problems and just one day to the other died while she was pregnant. And so she gave birth to their son after he had passed away, but also just when the French Revolution broke out. So what happened to his body is that he was buried first in a church, but then he was taken out and just dumped into a mass grave. So no one knows where he is now. But it does show you what would have probably happened to him anyways in the French Revolution. But luckily, Brigitte was able to flee. She went to Italy. She left her little baby in France in a farm close to the Chateau de Chastellux, that castle. And so what she did when she came back is she, of course, got her child back first, but then she put all the papers that Chastellux had left in his Parisian apartment. She brought it to the castle where she made sure that they were preserved, which of course is the reason we have all this information today. And so Alfred, the son of François-Jean and Brigitte, passed away without having children, but there is a cousin of his, so his brother had a child, and he is the one that is now continuing the family tree, let's say. And so he's also now, that's Philippe is part of all that. And so he has that tower full of archives there. All right, so the conclusion of all of this was that the friendships that are formed between these people during this reconnaissance mission, but also all this intelligence that was gathered, was a crucial and forgotten element of American independence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Two questions. First, what were the relations between Chastellux and Lafayette? And number two, where is Chastellux in France? Is it in the Massif Central or where?
Exactly
And
there.
can you visit it?
Yeah, so you can indeed, I have a map, which is like in slide very far away, so I can't show it, but it's really in the middle. It's like in the, so if you know a place called Avallon, which is it's close to the Morvan, it's like Nièvre region. I think you're French, so you might know, yeah. So so they have the castle you can visit for sure. It's open, I think, from March until September, and you can just go there. They have a website, chateau.chastellux.com, where you can see the hours. But yeah, you can visit it. The archive is not open to the public though, but the different rooms that are very beautiful, by the way. It's a beautiful castle. And so the relationship between Lafayette and Chastellux is that Chastellux was uncle of Adrienne de Noailles, the wife of Lafayette. And so Adrienne de Noailles was, her grandfather was D'Aguesseau, no, not grandfather, great-great-grandfather was D'Aguesseau, the Chancellor of France. And so Chastellux and her were related. And actually the mother of Adrienne de Noailles and François-Jean de Chastellux grew up together, because his father died, so he grew up with his uncle, and that's how they all got really close. So when Adrienne married Lafayette, they saw each other very regularly, and especially during the American campaign, they meet a lot actually. So they really are together, and they write to each other a lot too. And one of the interesting letters is where Lafayette really confides to his older uncle that he is extremely afraid, has no idea what he has to do. He's out of a sudden major general and asks for help from Chastellux. So that's an interesting thing, because of course he's about 30 years younger than Chastellux is.
Iris, did Chastellux serve with Lafayette's father?
Yes. So actually he was present at the Battle of Minden, which is the battle where Lafayette's father was killed. So Chastellux was there, as was Rochambeau, by the way. So they were all part of that generation, you're right. And when that happened, Lafayette was extremely young. I think he was 2 or 3 years old. So yes, 4, okay, he was 4 years old.
What was the relationship of Chastellux to the local community, given the way most of the aristocrats had like archives burned during the French Revolution?
Yes, good question. The Chastellux family fled with the sister of Louis XVI, actually, to Spain and Italy. So the castle was abandoned during that time, but there was a person from the village that, I don't know how you call this in English, but that was sort of said, like, can you please can you take care of it? And what he has done is that he put all the archives in a farm next to the castle, as well as the tapestries that I still have from the 14th century and a lot of paintings. So he's hidden them in places where people would not sort of look. And so that made it possible that it all survived, because that has been kept since, so that when they returned, they put it back in the castle. What happened with the rest of the castle is most of the furniture that was standing there was just too heavy to carry. That's all completely destroyed. You can still see, if you visit it now, that bigger, I don't know how you call all these things, but anyway, they're all destroyed by revolutionaries. Lots of things have been stolen, but that specific collection has been saved because of that man that had that idea to actually hide it all. So.
Bonjour. Two different questions. One, Chastellux seems a very modern man, so maybe a few comments on that. Secondly, on the opposite side, did he and some of the top French officers have American mistresses?
Oh, good question. Yes, Chastellux himself had at least 3, which you can find by looking at his correspondence. There is one called Anne Vernon in Newport, and another person, I believe, Anne Oliphant, and then another that I don't know her name of, but they are writing to him in a very flirtatious way, which is quite funny. And especially Anne Vernon writes to him that she wants to be his aide de camp. And she says, unfortunately, as a woman, I can't, but I'm sure that if that would have been possible, all American women would want to be your aide de camp. So it's like, and then they continue, but then apparently he does something with this Anne Oliphant. And then Anne Vernon is very upset by that. And so she writes to him that she is very just mad at him for going with the other. And so it's all quite dramatic. And of course, most of or not most, I'm sure a lot of them also did not. I think Rochambeau, for instance, was not really interested in that kind of things. But most of the younger officers are very well known to have had a lot of girlfriends around during this campaign. And that might sound a little sort of just funny, but it also is quite important because some of these women were very influential in America at the time. So for instance, in Philadelphia, some of these women were actually influential behind the scenes to influence politics and things. So women were, besides being mistresses, of course, also playing other types of roles that are maybe more important. So, and about the modernity, let's say, of Chastellux, of course, in his writings, that becomes quite apparent as him being one of these enlightened philosophers, but he's always in sort of a struggle with himself because he is an aristocrat. He is from that old tradition. He's one of the most old aristocratic families that have this very long tradition of especially military service. And then he out of a sudden appears this philosopher, which still today for the family is, by the way, a little bit problematic because they consider him a socialist and they consider that negative because they're themselves still royalists. So you can see that he is considered in his own family as someone very different. And I think that was his struggle personally, because you can read while he's writing about, for instance, America, that he really admires certain things, but then he is completely puzzled by others. So there's always this struggle within himself with, let's say, modernity and more conservative sides clashing.
So you're in the chateau, you go up in the tower, you don't know what you're going to find, but you know there's this big archive. You're opening up the first box, you see these letters from Washington. What's going through your head? Who are you texting first? What, tell us about that.
Well, there's no signal, so that was a problem. I couldn't inform people, but because when I found, or when we opened them and I saw these names, I was like, well, I'm sure it's just kind of fake, or I don't know. I just didn't realize. And then when you open it, it looks very real. And then there are lots of different handwritings. And now I would definitely recognize immediately what all these handwritings were. But I was about 21 or something. And I was like, I have no idea if this is all real. So I was going through it, and then I asked Chastellux, but so are you sure? Is this not some scam, someone? And he's like, no, actually, I didn't even know he had it. So it became very exciting, of course, and going through all that. It also was, so the first hours were very exciting, and then it also became a little overwhelming because there was so much. And even if it stays, of course, extremely important and nice, it also just became like, oh, this is so much work to understand all this. But still, of course, overall, it was just extremely fun to do. And still today, I'm still finding new things when I start to open my little photos again that I took. There's still so much to discover, like things that I have totally not told, of course, today. But one of his interesting parts is that he wrote 7 theater pieces. So the other day I was going through them just because you have to go see, and his theater pieces reflect his enlightened ideas again about reforms and stuff, but he also just adapts Romeo and Juliet and makes it a happy ending. So these kind of things are just very funny to discover. And it's still, as I said, it always leads to new finds and to other interesting things about this man that is so diverse, let's say.
Just 2 points. One of the reasons why the French were supposed to have mistresses is quite surprising. At the time they were marrying for land. It was an arranged marriage.
Yeah.
They were not supposed to fall in love with their wife. They were not even supposed to marry their love of their life. They were supposed to marry for the land or for the properties. And so it was totally accepted that both the wife and the man would have love life. So that's number one. Number two, if you go to Chavagnac, which is where Lafayette obviously is from, there is also a cabinet where they found, like you, a lot of his letters that went to Washington and to everybody actually, and those letters actually are now in Cornell. And if you go to Cornell University at the library, you can actually look at the PDF of all these letters. And even if you ask, they will be very nice, and they will bring to you the letters, and you can have in your hand letters from Washington to Lafayette and stuff. And it's very, very, very moving. Yeah,
it really is. It's true. It's very moving when you see them in front of you, just because, of course, it's 250 years apart. It's still there. So.
Hi, I'm quite intrigued by the evolution of the military ideas around the Enlightenment. And I'm curious if he had any interactions with anyone from Prussia, which is where that was coming from, the enlightened king. You mentioned Frederick the Great.
Yep.
Or of course, our man, Le Baron de Steuben.
Mhm.
And were there interactions that you saw with the Prussian military? And could you talk a little bit about how that may have impacted him?
Yes, it impacted him a lot because, of course, during the 7 Years' War, he saw the Prussian army in action against him, and he got very intrigued. He wrote a whole book about it, about the Prussian army. He wrote about 10 reports on analyzing the entire Prussian army and what the French could learn from it. So he was very highly involved. He was very close to Guibert, who was, well, the military theorist, who became very famous for actually sort of how do you call it, adapting the Prussian example to the French army. And Chastellux and him were in the same regiment and were together all the time. They're writing to each other about the Prussian system. And then Chastellux translated the Prussian instructions, so the instructions of Frederick the Great, he translated that in French so that it became available in France because he considered it such an important lesson. And then he wrote his own introduction to that, in which you can see his pure admiration for Frederick the Great. But also he then, so I think Helvetius, one of his philosopher friends, sends that book to Frederick the Great. And then Frederick the Great starts to write to Chastellux about the fact he translated it, that he it was not really what he wanted, that was so well spread. But then he was like, well, thank you anyways, do that. So he is, of course, very inspired by that. And then going into details that I will not go on too much, but column formations that he saw in, so the column meaning specific ways of columns to march and to perform their battles. Chastellux is really analyzing them, and then in his reports on how to reform the French army, wants to adopt them to make the French army faster than they were before and more deadly, actually, to have more direct attacks than they had before. So yes, lots of overlap there.
Oh. Hello, quick question continuing the theme of archive preservation. As someone who grew up and now lives in a rather humid, muggy city, how are the documents even still preserved today to page through?
So that's a nice question, because it's always fun to tell that the whole archive has been very well preserved. And the reason is that the stones of that specific tower is a specific stone that was used at the time already. I mean, at the time of when the different archives were very important. So the stone makes the humidity, it just absorbs humidity. So there's no humidity at all in all these papers. They're extremely well preserved. The ink is just exactly the way it used to be. And luckily no animals, that's another problem. Little mice can eat the papers. So that didn't happen because it's all very well protected in like metal boxes actually. And so one of the reasons that the French aristocracy really needed to preserve their papers was, of course, to prove their nobility. So one of the most important rooms in a castle is actually your archive. So they made it very well already at the time, and still today, that's the way it's preserved.
Oh, thank you for a great presentation. First of all, I have a couple of brief questions. The first one is maybe stupid, but do you see the resemblance between Marquis Chastellux and the gentleman in the picture above you? They seem to be.
You feel they resemble each other
Yeah.
physically? Well, who knows what's happened there?
Yeah, okay. Second question is, historians praise Marquis Chastellux' fluency in English. They say that it helped to enhance the communication, the bilateral communication between the French and the American side, is knowledge of English, which I guess was not that common. Where did he learn English? Where was he? And also, I have a question about a gentleman by the name of Louis Alexander Berthier, who served as captain of infantry in expeditionary French forces. And after the revolution, the French Revolution, he he most ably served as Napoleon's chief of staff.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the only one who was able to read Napoleon's deplorable notes, and he translated them into magnificent campaign order and all this and that. So did, again, Marquis Chastellux by any chance mention in his memoirs Captain Berthier at that time. Yeah, thank you.
So about the first question, the English side. So Chastellux indeed spoke English, which is one of the reasons he became quite influential in this alliance, because he could speak to the Americans while most of his rank could not. Of course, the French were starting to learn English when they arrived. So at the end of their campaign, a lot of the officers did speak somewhat English, but Chastellux arrived speaking fluent because he, according to himself, he describes this, that when he saw the first saw David Hume's books, he wanted to read them in their original language. Chastellux did that with almost every book. So he learned German, Spanish, Latin and Greek, German as well, like all these different languages, because he wanted to understand the real books, let's say, the real languages. And so English he was learning for David Hume's books, but then also when he met David Hume, he could actually talk to him, because David Hume came to the French salons of which he was part. And then he also went to England 3 times in his life to do one of these tours. So he was quite involved in English, and he was very interested in the whole English system, by the way, before going to America. And about Berthier, Chastellux, of course, so Berthier joins just after, they come a little later, the Berthier brothers, when Chastellux is already there, but of course they work together, and especially map making becomes very important to them. So Chastellux making these maps, I'm assuming they would work together. I don't have really proof of that, but of course Chastellux was involved in map making. Berthier was as well, so probably they have worked together. Today in the Library of Congress, you can find a lot of these Berthier maps that are part of the Rochambeau collection. And so Berthier indeed became an important figure of the Napoleon's army, which I think is interesting and would be worth digging a bit more into, of this whole military enlightenment and what influence that had on Napoleon, because most of these young officers that survived the French Revolution, at least, were part of the Napoleonic armies afterwards. So there must be a type of continuation there that would be very interesting to look at.
Dr. DeRode, you're defending your research very well. Can you go back to the picture with Chastellux and Washington? I've never actually seen Washington so relaxed.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that image?
I have to admit that I just found it and I like the image, but I don't really know much more about the painting. But I did think it was about, because Washington always is often very strict. Like you see him as a commander or as the president, or just very serious. And I thought it illustrates well how he is behaving with Chastellux, his friend, because he's way more funny and relaxed. And as I showed, he makes jokes about the wife, but he also makes in a few letters, they make fun references to them having been drunk, actually. So he's like, you remember how hilarious that was? Blah, blah. So they just have a lot of fun together. So that's why, but I don't know much more. I should have known, but yeah.
Iris, I love this notion of friendship, and I never thought about these men this way. And when I think about kind of the modern lexicon to describe friendship, it's incredibly vast, right? I've got my bestie, my squad, my core group, my friends for life, right? My old homies, right? We have so many ways to think about the people in our life. And I'm wondering if you can maybe add some layering to, you know, who his closest friends were. Maybe not, you don't have to say squad or bestie, but maybe something like that, of just not just this incredibly impressive network of people that he communicated with and were friends with, but more, you know, what are like the core relationships there?
Yeah, it's also a good question of what is a friend to these people, because if it's just you write a few letters to each other, are you friends? And especially as a historian, you don't really know. Like there are so many reasons that people can write to each other. And for instance, Voltaire and Chastellux are quite clearly very, if you want to say, the besties there, because they write so much to each other. You can like Chastellux grew up with Voltaire. Voltaire almost lived in his home because he was always with D'Aguesseau, his grandfather, grew up together and then become very close. But still, Voltaire needed him as well, because he needed to stay out of the Bastille, and Chastellux could help him with that. So these kind of things are always a little tricky to reconstruct. But I would still say that Chastellux, when he came here to America, he became seriously close to Washington and Jefferson. And you can, as I try to show, at least through all these different letters, that friendship was very sincere. And Chastellux really admires both men for their intellects. Maybe that's most of the time his real, let's say, attraction. He loves talking to people and exchanging. So as soon as that's possible, so he becomes very close to these two. But in France, he was mainly closer to a few aristocrats or his, no, that's not the word, philosophers of his circle. And the most close he was with is someone called Helvetius, who is not very known, but some people do know him. But he was known as a quite sort of an atheist, actually, like Chastellux himself was sort of too long to explain, but they are really close. They're together almost every day. And then another very close person to Chastellux is his sister, who is not necessarily his best friend, but they're really, really close. Everything they write to each other, that tone comes out very clearly.
I don't want to forget about our friends on Zoom here,
Oh,
so
yeah.
I do have a few questions from there. There's a conflict, an obvious conflict between Chastellux and Rochambeau, especially when Chastellux writes the letter to Luzerne. It's captured by the British, and the question is, was post-war, what was the relationship between Chastellux and Rochambeau, since Chastellux was obviously closer to Washington than he was with Rochambeau?
It doesn't seem that there's much. There's no correspondence between the two. I have to look in that camera, apparently. But so there's no correspondence between the two after the war, which could be surprising because they've served so long together. There's that whole, it's too long to explain the whole story, why there's some friction between Rochambeau and Chastellux, and if that's actually even true. But they write there is a letter that it got intercepted by the British in which Chastellux writes very negatively about Rochambeau. But it can be interpreted as if he needed that to be the information that was circulating, while that was maybe not true. So that's a whole other question. But I would say that they were at least very sort of collegial with each other. They were, of course, working for the same goal, and they had exactly the same military, or not exactly. Rochambeau was more senior and had served longer in different wars because he was older, but they were part of the same military enlightened group. Rochambeau had been advising the French kings on how to reform his army, just like Chastellux had done. So they were very like-minded. So I don't really believe in that whole friction. They might have had some disputes, obviously, but I don't think that they didn't necessarily work well together. However, after the war, they don't seem to have been close. I think one of the main reasons is both characters are very different. Rochambeau is always described as being sort of a stubborn man who was really into his military mission and not much more. He didn't like the court of Versailles. He didn't like that glittering Parisian world, while Chastellux lived in all that. It was his main sort of raison d'etre, is being part of the glittering society of Paris. So they just didn't really mingle well, I would say.
One question about your research: how much of it was found at the castle rather than other sources?
Yeah, so I would say my research, of course, I started with the Chastellux archive, but then quite quickly I had to go through lots of other archives too and read many books of other, of course, historians that have worked on this too. So you can't just base everything on just one archive, mainly because that will just create a very one-sided image. Probably Chastellux has, of course, left out a lot of information. People might have thrown things out. Obviously, his wife has probably done that too, because there's no correspondence with that whole mistress that I spoke about in his own archive, which is a little special, you could say, after 25 years. So anyway, you need to go through other sources. And so, of course, I used I think I use about 18 different archives. So I'm not going to tell you all of them. But an interesting part is that Chastellux' papers led me to other discoveries, let's say. So La Luzerne, for instance, the French ambassador that I showed had quite an interesting role in it all. He was quite forgotten, but he had written about 50 letters to Chastellux. So I got intrigued and went to the archives where his papers are kept in the diplomatic archives of France. But then also one of his main correspondents is another person called Viaud-Menil, and Viaud-Menil is quite an unknown figure, but he's also a major general in the army. And his papers have been described as just burned or lost, but actually they have been kept. So I recently found that whole collection too. And I don't necessarily want to explain that whole story again, because it's going to add 10 minutes, but it was a very interesting find because they were actually thought lost, but this entire collection is actually kept in a place called Le Creusot, which apparently is very close to Chastellux. So it's a coincidence there, but it's in a metal industrial archive of the metal industry of a place called Le Creusot, which is known for the pans Le Creuset. Anyway, it's too long to really explain why it ended up there, but one find leads to a lot of others, because of course, it reveals other figures that are apparently more important at the time than we know today. So you can retrace all these figures there.
And I think this is a good final question. What do you think the biggest takeaway from Chastellux' time in America was for him personally throughout his entire,
Yeah.
from the toasting and the Blue Jays and so?
Well, that was very important to him. He actually brought a lot of these little birds with him to give them to his friends. So that's funny. But his main takeaway, I would say, is that it really changed his whole perspective. So he went to America full of these sort of his own ideals, and they were all confirmed for him. Not all, it's more nuanced than that, but we could say that overall he went to America with the hope of finding this expanding nation full of promises for the future. He would call it a new country compared to his old, what he would call sick country. There was a new country where everything could be tested. So to him, that was extremely exciting. And when he was there, he found that most of the time. He was disappointed by some minor details, but overall, he really believed in this progress of this new nation in which everything could still be done. It was kind of this open land for him, which really held the promise of happiness, which he held so dear because he wrote about it so much.
Perfect. I think that is a great place to wrap up. I want to thank you, Dr. DeRode, for coming out and speaking. I want to thank all of you for attending in person and at home. Thank you for your continued support of our mission. So we'll see you next time. Get home safe.